Are you still with me, Elliot?
Here we go, ladies and gentlemen.
Welcome to the Hackaday podcast. My name's Mike Szczys. I'm editor-in-chief of Hackaday.
Hi, I'm Elliot Williams. I'm managing editor of Hackaday.
This is episode 99, our 100th episode. Today we're talking about Denture Synth, OLED Keycaps, and SNES Raytracing. This is our 100th episode. I knew you'd come through with the party blower.
I tell you what.
What are we supposed to do for 100 episodes, Elliot?
Blow party blowers and jump up and down.
Well, we are doing something new. I have right next to my microphone a cocktail.
Oh, fantastic. What do you got?
I am enjoying an old-fashioned made with Redemption High Rye, which has become one of my favorites during this pandemic time. How about you? What are you drinking today?
Nothing yet. Hold on one sec. Let's see if I can do this without getting it all over the microphone. This is trouble right here, ladies and gentlemen, with a capital T, and that rhymes with P. And that stands for Prosecco. Hold on.
Yeah. And even with the glug glugs.
I think that's going to come across,
actually. Yeah, it sounds great.
Super. Anyway, cheers, man. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers to you, Ellie. I mean, really cheers to you because you do all the editing, and that is by far the hardest part of podcasting.
I have to say cheers to our listeners who keep us going. We get tons of good feedback from y'all. Makes us feel like we're not just talking to each other, talking into the ether, but actually talking to you folks out there.
Hang on just a sec. I'm looking something up.
Oh, that's okay. I'm drinking champagne.
Yeah, I'm always so tickled when I come across someone that's a podcast listener. Guy DuPont did a workshop at the Remoticon, and I just wrote it up. It was about getting started with Max, which is the graphical programming language. And I wrote him and I said, hey, I loved this. You know, I'm a big fan of yours. I don't know if you remember, he did that Wurlitzer keyboard visualizer. And then he did I can't remember the name of it, but it was like a clock radio that played the playlist.
The Bonnaroo playlist one. That was awesome.
And I was like, I've been a huge fan of you since this. He's like, I'm a huge fan of you and Elliot. I listen to the podcast. It's great. And I'm like, that's so nice.
It is really nice, isn't it?
Yeah. So let's see. 100 episodes. It is episode number 99, but our very first episode was the best of 2018. And we thought of doing the best of 2020 today. But the thing is, we do the podcast every single week. It's like a clip show at this point if we try to do best of.
Go back and listen to our back catalog.
Yeah.
You got 99 episodes to catch up on.
Yeah. So if you're bored, you know, if you're like me and you're trying to finish up the trophies on Just Cause 4 and you're doing a lot of grinding right now, you just put a bunch of podcasts on in the background and grind away.
I have to admit that when we started out, we didn't number our first podcast, which is how we got episode 99 to be our 100th podcast, because we didn't know it was going to take. And then when we did start, I was like, all right, it's podcast number 1. I'm going to call it 001, because if we call it 1 or 01, it's like, are we going to do 10 podcasts? If we call it 001, we can do 999 podcasts before we run out of digits.
That's a lot of podcasts. That's what, it's been 2 years to do 100. So to do 900 more.
I'll admit that when I did it, I was like, oh, that's a little ballsy. Are we going to pull this off? Is this going to keep going that long? But here we are, ladies and gentlemen. Next podcast, we roll over and my speculative third digit becomes useful.
Yeah, and I think the really reason that we can keep it going is because we have an amazing community of people that are doing the projects that we talk about each week. And then we have this unbelievable pool of talent in the Hackaday writers that are looking through all the projects trying to figure out which ones are cool and why. And that's a huge jumpstart on being able to filter stuff down to an hour worth of interest each week.
Yeah, we're just top feeders. We're top feeders. We just sit there and we skim the cream.
Skimming.
Skim the cream.
Well, all right. Enough patting ourselves on the back. Congratulations, Elliot. It's been a pleasure.
Congratulations.
Also, I loved listening last week. You and Tom did a great job. It was totally fun.
Yeah, we had a really good time.
Let's go ahead and jump right into the hacks that we have for our last episode of 2020. And the first one that I picked goes along with my unfortunate day drinking that is happening today. It is the over-engineered bottle opener takes the drudgery out of drinking. This is a project that Matt McCoy built to whimsically, is that the word for it? Pop the top off of a bottle of beer, and this is a great place for an audio podcast to really demonstrate. That's what it sounds like. Yeah. Have you watched the video on this one?
No, I'm just about to.
Oh, I don't know if it's over-engineered. It's definitely over-engineered. Let's say that. But it's over-engineered in a way that is meant to be funny and also destructively functional. Because when you see this 3-axis bottle opener pop the top off of some Sam Adams, the head goes all over the place and gets all over the robot itself. And I'm just like kind of cringing. But then I'm like, wait, how did that do it? Because it's not kind of like the lever style. It just has this hook that goes under the bottle cap. And if you look at it, it's got maybe 6 of these heavy duty elastic bands that are tying 2 machined aluminum pieces together. And then there's a gantry, like a double railed gantry that's the Z-axis that is pulling this thing up, and it hooks under the cap. And that's when the elastic starts stretching, and it keeps going up, and eventually it overcomes, bends the cap, tosses it off, and snaps out of place. It's geekily violent.
What's holding it down? So it's got a little beak that latches under the cap and tries to push it up. What is holding the bottle down?
Well, so the other 2 axes are what's going on here. So you have a little tray that you set the bottle on, and then let's call it the x-axis moves it towards the machine, and then the y-axis is a bottle-shaped clamp that also has those elastic straps in it that come together. And then that's when once that's closed and it's gripped on the bottle, kind of like where your hand would go, then the Z-axis goes into play.
I'm watching this thing go in slow-mo now. He's just hoping that he hits it hard enough and fast enough that the cap comes off before the bottle ends up flying into the room. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, at the beginning, he says no broken bottles.
It's really, but it's really just the like specific impulse. It's just getting that hit fast enough that the cap comes off and the bottle sits there, because the bottle's kind of wiggly in that little holder.
Oh, maybe I misunderstood how this worked, because I thought that it hooked on the bottle and then stretched out those elastic bands. But you're thinking it's stretching out the elastic bands and then triggering them.
Yeah, it's stretching out the elastic bands and then letting it go, and that then sends the hook flying up, and it goes kapak and knocks the bottle cap off.
Oh, yeah. So it's like pulling the tablecloth out from under the vase if you're a magician.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
You got to get that cap off before you move the bottle and send it flying through the room. I see what you're saying.
Was this a project for school? Why do you make one of these?
For the imaginary internet points.
Sheer madness of making one.
And I like it. I mean, the best. I just got to the end again. He does a little like robot shimmy at the end. Like the machine is so happy that it performed its task. Yeah. It's great. I love it. It's way over engineered, and he says I don't care, and that's the way to do your projects, folks.
My first hack this week is Solar Pi Zero e-paper photo frame waits for the right moment. This is a project by Giacomo Micheli. It's a really interesting idea. He wants to build a solar-powered e-paper photo frame, right? But the easiest way to do this is probably to put a Raspberry Pi, in this case it's a Pi Zero, behind it. The smart and power-efficient way to do this is to use some microcontroller that just boots up real quick and gets it done. To make the not smart way work is actually really interesting, and maybe even a little bit more interesting. There are a couple things here that make this a viable project, even though the power budget shouldn't work out. One of those is that he's got the boot time on the Pi Zero down to about 20 seconds, which is pretty fast for a Pi Zero, and he does that by stripping away all the things he doesn't need. It then connects to a server, downloads the image, displays it on the e-paper, and then goes back to sleep. Because this thing is solar powered, it's got some batteries that it can charge up when the sun's shining on it, but it pretty soon runs out of power. And this is the part that I think is especially cool. It's got a battery minder on it that knows when the battery is charged up enough to warrant waking up and updating the photo, or when it's not. And that's what I think is really cool. It's got a little real-time clock unit on there and a battery minder. There's a little microcontroller in the battery minder that wakes up periodically, says, do I have enough juice? If it does have enough juice, it turns on the Raspberry Pi, which then does its thing. And if it doesn't have enough juice, it just sits there and waits. So this project is either going to update the photo every hour when it's got enough power, or once every couple days, he was saying, when it doesn't have enough power. And I think that's really cool. I don't know, it's like the photo frame's almost alive, right? It's like when the sun's shining, I'm doing cool stuff. And when the sun's not shining, I'm not doing anything. I'm sleeping. I wanted to dig into this because I think this is a useful mode for a lot of kind of remote deployed Raspberry Pi projects. And I was kind of a little bit disappointed, I guess, to find that what does the real-time clock and microcontroller and battery management stuff is a little board you can just buy for like $20 called Pi Juice, and you can add your own battery to it, and it does all this battery management stuff. The project is not quite open source. I'm going to throw the link to their GitHub in the links for the show here. But they also describe enough of the parts that if you know what you're doing, you can go look through this project and build something like this yourself fairly easily. If you don't, spend the $20 and buy this thing. Throw these guys a bone. It's a nice looking design, actually. But if you do want to implement something like this yourself, now you've got a template for it. They do it really professionally with like a fuel gauge IC and a charger IC and stuff like that. So it's really nice project. I bet you could cut a couple corners if you wanted to do it cheap.
Yeah, and it looks like it requires some kind of software. So I think this would be a really interesting implementation if it kind of had a standalone and could be used with any device you wanted.
I didn't actually look too hard into what the software does. I think it just has a couple pins that it toggles telling the Pi why it woke up.
Oh yeah, here it says it will actually work straight out of the box with no software to power the Pi and for some other basic functionality.
I thought that kind of interplay between the two, plus the solar angle, plus the like sleep when you need to, it makes me think of like a squirrel or something that goes to sleep in the wintertime and then, oh, it's warm, I'm going to wake up and eat some acorns. Oh, it's cold, I'm going to go hibernate for a week. It's kind of, it's almost alive, right?
Oh yeah. Well, we've seen those slow movie players, and I built one and it's sitting on my desk. And I'd love to do something like this because, this is just sitting on my desk burning USB power 24 hours a day for no reason. How often am I really looking at it? If you can take out the power connection from that and you use ambient light, it makes the slowness and the anticipation even that much better.
Oh, and that makes the slowness actually kind of worthwhile, right? Like it makes it actually doing less stuff and consuming less juice and gives you a reason for the solar power anyway.
Right, and I think there's a lot of optimization to be done here too. The Pi is kind of overkill in this situation.
Oh yeah.
I get why you do it. I mean, this Pi juice board is made for the Pi. And then when you buy these e-paper displays, the adapter that they give it with is usually made for the Pi. I think there are also some Arduino form factor adapters. But you really don't, like, driving the display is an I2C. I think it's I2C. It's one of those chip-to-chip communication protocols. So it's not a lot of connections. It doesn't require a lot of overhead. The thing for me, I grabbed an ESP32 and I used the Arduino IDE just so I could handle the internet stack through that. So you need something that's going to be able to get the images from the internet for you. But someone in the comments of this article was saying, you should cache them locally. So even if you stuck with the Raspberry Pi here, I could see it waking up and turning on the radio in order to get on the network just to download, the next hour or 3 of images, and then not turning on peripherals when it woke up in the future.
Yeah, I think you're right. The ESP32 is kind of the right choice for this because it's got the Wi-Fi you need and it can go into a low power mode and it wakes up pretty quickly. Like, that's the right way to do it. But I thought what was really neat here was the kind of, the engineering around doing it the wrong way, because sometime you're going to need a project that wants to do it the wrong way. And so now you know how to handle the battery side of things when that time comes.
Well, let's talk about full color circuit boards. I have been really intrigued seeing a few of these, and the most recent one that I remember seeing was from Little Bird's CEO back in 2019, who were showing off UV printed inks on circuit boards. And there was a lot of hope at that time that something would come of it. And I haven't seen anything until we got to this article that Jenny List wrote called Bringing Full Color PCB Art to Production. This is the makers of the 2019 Camp Zone badge looking to do another production run of that badge and wanting to spice it up. And Tom Clement actually dug into working with producers in China to get new processes available for these. It's interesting because UV inkjet printers on an industrial scale are already available. They're used for things like sign printing, but it hasn't really been applied to PCBs except for a few of these experiments. And this is a nice dive into testing that out. So looking at things like what happens once you print the UV ink and then put it in a reflow oven. And in this case, it dulls a lot of the colors and it turns the white a little bit yellow. The solution for that is not to print with white ink, but to use the solder mask or silk screen on your circuit board as white. And it kind of takes care of that. The board comes out great, even if it is a little bit dimmed. You have to be a little careful about the tolerances because these printers can't be quite as accurate as the PCB production or PCB fabrication process is. But all in all, this is a huge win. And I love thinking that this will be available on a more accessible basis sometime in the near future.
I remember seeing some UV curing inks used for like solder mask, and someone was suggesting you could do it for an etch resist, and then you could like go take your board to the nail salon, get them to run the UV curing ink over the top of it, and then etch the rest away. I think there's a lot to be explored in this area. And now that these kind of UV curing ink machines that do multiple colors are becoming, at least the services to get them done for you are becoming inexpensively available, it's like just the right time to start experimenting around with this stuff.
Yeah, Brian Petchoff did a bunch of experiments with more colorful circuit boards over the past few years, and we'll link to that. He even did a talk at the SuperCon and did a guide on pad printing, which is like you have a silicone, I don't know what you call it, bumper, stamp, something like that, that picks up ink from a pad that's been produced through a photolithographic process and then stamps it onto the circuit board itself. In this case, I mean, it'd just be nicer if you could get it done at an industrial scale because, yeah, you could do multiple colors with a pad printer like that, but it's difficult when you're just, doing low production runs to get the setup to go really nicely for that. In this case, I would be hopeful that, we have all these PCB fabrication wars going on right now, and you see the advertising everywhere for it. Right. I would hope that one of these companies would look at something like this and say, hey, we know people that do UV printing. Why don't we figure out how to add this to our process? And it would then become available for hackers.
Sounds good to me. If they can get the registration right, I'm all in. Colorful PCBs will look pretty cool. All right, my next hack, Adaptive Macro Pad uses tiny OLED screens as keycaps, is a fantastic little hack by Max K. This is actually, on the surface, fairly simple. It's a 3x3 array of OLED screens. They're on little springs, and underneath them sit some tack switches. And so the idea is you can remap a picture on top of each screen to show you what the macro that your computer will fire off when you press each button is. The details here are what makes this project really fantastic. So you should head on over to the Hackaday IO page where he's working all this out. The first one that's really cool, I think, is the spring mechanism itself, because this isn't just a capacitive touch screen where you press it and you don't know if you've pressed it. This is a screen where you actually press the OLEDs down and they are on little hinges. And the design of the hinges is really clever. In particular, he wanted to minimize the footprint of this thing. And so the hinges kind of overlap each other in a really interesting way. He had to do tests, multiple 3D printed tests to get the hinge right. And once he did that, he was ready to make his array. The STM chip on this thing talks to the computer both as an HID keyboard, But then it also opens up a serial interface so that the computer can tell it what the current running app is and then what images to put on each of the different macro keyboards. And I think this is an elegant solution. This one was programmed for Windows. I guess the host side stuff all runs in C#. But because it uses a serial protocol between the computer and the macro keyboard, actually it's just transferring, serial data. So it doesn't matter if you're using this on a Windows computer or a Mac computer or a Linux computer. If you can write the host software that tells it what images to put in each of the slots, you're done. And that's all over serial. So it actually should be fairly simple to adapt. But it is also super cool that he's hooked into a Windows library C# stuff where it knows where the program that has foreground focus is. I guess it's got an XML file with all of the images in it. And so it sends the right images to it. So when you switch from one window to another, from your web browser to Photoshop, it instantly pulls up the right images to go with the macros. And I just think that's really, really slick. There are, of course, commercial products that work like this. This one is fully as slick as any of those. So take that.
Best use of a small OLED screen that I've ever seen here.
Yeah, absolutely.
The aesthetic of this as well is really nice. It's not just a black box. There's a gray bezel on top of the keys, and the keys are in a 3x3 grid. And I like that there's a little tab at the top of this gray bezel that's kind of like the file folder, the thing you would label on a file folder. It kind of breaks up that squareness to it and gives it a really polished finish. And I also can't help but think back to, do you remember that Optimus keyboard? It might have been called like the Optimus Maximus.
Yeah, that's the
where
one.
Every single key was supposed to be a color OLED. I'm not sure it ever happened.
Or if it did, it was like $1,000,000.
Right. Just having this, it's not, mechanical switches like you would want in that keyboard, but having this sit on your desk, and then also, like you said, having the utility of pulling up those quick keys that are self-assignable.
Self-documenting.
Yeah, I would almost like this for maybe like a extended clipboard cut and paste thing, so you could keep track of what's in each of your clipboards.
Sure.
Yeah, this is great design. I love it.
I'm glad that you picked up on that design because I did too. And that little like lippy thing there is just, it adds flair. It's really beautiful. And I was like, wow, that's really awesome. I'm going to see what other projects this Max K guy has done. And stumbled upon his old little FPV robots, including the ZeroBot, which was a Raspberry Pi camera and a nice 3D printed enclosure that he entered in the Hackaday prize a few years ago. Then he made an ESP32 update of this that was in the Hackaday prize last year. And these have been on my to print for my son list for quite a long time now. And they're also just these absolutely beautiful, minimalist, very well done 3D printed designs. So good on you, Max K. And before we leave this, I have to mention a similar screen approach that instead of using individual OLEDs, actually used a single screen and had little clear buttons that would press on top of it. This one is retro calculator design, has creative tactile touchscreen. It was done for a mock Hewlett-Packard series calculator, and because Hewlett-Packard nerds can't decide which Hewlett-Packard layout is the best one, this lets you do all of them. If you want to see the one screen take on a similar sort of thing, you should go check that one out. The clever thing there is it's on a scissor lift, so whichever one of the buttons you press, the whole big screen goes up and down and presses on a key underneath it.
Now, this next one is a good example of why we can't do a year in review, Elliot, because every week I would find a project and I'd be like, this has to be the hack of the year right here. But it's possible that this one is the hack of the year. It just keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. And Dan Foisey, who pulled this off, did such an amazing job of documenting it. You have to go and read his write-up on this. It's fascinating. I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of it. Maybe you can help, Elliot, but we'll get there. It is a spinning persistence of vision display, which has forever been on my list to build a big one of these. And this one is the size of a soft taco tortilla, and it has LEDs mounted on the edge all around this circuit board. And then the circuit board is put into the spindle of an upward pointed motor and spun at high speed. And then it lights up at just the right moment to create a full color image and does an excellent job of it.
Yeah, what I love about this one, it looks like he's got really good resolution on this thing. And then you look at the scale and it's got even more insanely high resolution than that. He is jamming these little LEDs together so tight you can't believe. And there are 256 of them around the circumference of this thing. Like, it's got to be pushing a lot of data into them.
Yeah. So an FPGA obviously is the way to go with this because you can push all of that data. Let's just get to the mechanical part of it. First of all, the layout is done programmatically with KiCad so that you can get the footprints for all of these parts to be exactly on the angle that it's supposed to be for that part of the board. The little footprints, I think maybe it's a 50/50 package. Does that sound right?
I think they've got to be smaller from the look of it. Let me see.
Are they smaller than that? It's made so that the distance in between the conductors on the bottom of the LED, that's our RGB LED, so there's a ground and then a positive for each of the three colors. So there's 4 pins. It's 1.6 millimeters in between those feet, which is exactly the width of the most common type of substrate for circuit board. So if you take the pads and you put 2 of them on one side of the board edge and 2 of them on the other side of the board edge, you can then put the LED on the edge itself and then bridge from the pad to the foot itself. Unless the board house decides to be very helpful and realizes that your pads are going to fall off the edge of the board, and so they make the cut edge of the board larger so you don't cut through the pads. And then you get it and you go, well, crap. Now I have to sand the board down. Yeah. So Dan has to deal with that. And one of the things, I always appreciate it when people at the end of their write-ups go through the things that they're frustrated with, because it really tells the rest of the story on what drove the decisions for this. And one of the things he mentions is this sanding process was not exact, and it ends up making it difficult for all of the conductors to be connected. And if you look closely in this picture, which shows like Luigi holding up a card, there's a blue line that goes through his nose, and that's a place where probably the red and green conductors for that one LED didn't quite get hooked up. So there's a couple of these around, but by and large, the thing works perfectly.
If you have 2 bad contacts out of 256 3-color LEDs, that's what? That's 1/3% failure rate? I mean,
yeah.
It says here in his write-up that the LEDs are 1.6 millimeters square.
Oh, geez.
So they're 16 by 16. They're 16/16 instead of 50/50. So they're less than half.
That's so crazy.
The width. So they're, less than a quarter of the area of a WS2812, if you're thinking of that in your head.
He mentions this part, the TLC 5955, that he's using to drive the LEDs. It has 48 connections with 16-bit pulse width modulation. So you can drive 16 of these RGB LEDs with it.
Right.
But it has a special feature called Enhanced Spectrum Pulse Width Modulation Control, PWM control, which I've not heard of before. And it's described like a set of buckets. And when you set your value, it puts a 1 in some of those buckets. The closest I can get is it sounds kind of like binary coded modulation.
That's totally what it sounds like, doesn't it?
Yeah. So what he's doing is he only uses a particular multiple of like 0x80. And then what it does is it effectively multiplies the pulse width modulation clock by 128 because of the trick that he's found with this part. And then that gets him up to the resolution that he needs for a refresh rate that keeps up with the RPM of the display.
That is a brutal constraint. If you've done POV with a single color LED, it's really easy. You just turn it on and off as you spin it. But in this case, the LEDs, to get different colors, have to be doing PWM. So they have to be turning on and off to make the different hues. And that has to be going fast enough that your eyes do the flicker fusion thing. So these are really fast PWM rates that need to be pushing these things on and off. And I think that's why he has to use, just raw LEDs and then these really fast LED driver chips to make it work at all.
There's so much more to this project. Go check it out. We just don't have time to talk about it here, but he tries and fails to use a Hall effect sensor and moves to photo interrupter. There's just a million different things in here. And Dan, I loved seeing the project and had a great time reading it. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
If blinking an LED is like the hello world of microcontrollers, the hello world for FPGAs is blinking a heck of a lot of LEDs really fast. And that's what this POV project is doing. My next project, an SNES Raytracing by Ben Carter, is putting an FPGA to a much harder task. And let's talk about this. Ben sets himself the goal of building a ray tracer in an FPGA that then he can plug in to a otherwise completely stock SNES Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or as Ben says throughout his video, SNES. Have you heard SNES before?
I've heard SNES before, and I don't say that, but I think that Jenny List must say SNES because you would say a SNES, but you would say an SNES. So that's how you can tell.
I think you're deep in the scene if you say SNES and
SNES.
And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not deep in this scene.
No, I am not at all.
But apparently there were some old SNES games that used like coprocessors. So they would use the cartridge to put a graphics processing unit on or add extra ROM or whatever else. Oh, and we've seen a bunch of hacks where people do crazy things like they'll put a Raspberry Pi into the cartridge slot and have the SNES, quote, play Doom. This hack is in some ways much more straight up. The FPGA is just running essentially a ray tracing coprocessor for an SNES game that is also hosted on the cartridge that runs. In a lot of ways, this is like something that could have been done back in the old days of the SNES. This is just the most complicated, fanciest graphic processor in a cartridge you've ever seen. So this like out Star Fox's Star Fox. What he builds in this FPGA is essentially a single purpose, that is ray tracing GPU, and it's got 3 simultaneous ray tracing engines in it. And his demo here is fantastic. It runs like the whole gamut of ray tracing tricks. For those of you who don't know ray tracing, the idea is you imagine the viewer to be outside the screen looking at each pixel, and you say, where does the imaginary line that goes from your eye through any given pixel land in the kind of imaginary universe on the other side of the screen? Depending on how far you want to take that, you can have these rays diffract, diffuse, refract, figure out if they're in the shadows, all of this sort of stuff, and you can make incredibly realistic scenery. And that's what he's doing here. And so his SNES demo has like concave mirrors in it, reflecting balls. It has a water pool. There's like occlusions that go through and reveal things and then hide them. And then these show up in reflections. And then the whole thing has shadows. And it's all done in real time through this kind of GPU in an FPGA. And that is really cool. Ben mentions in his video that he wanted to do this to learn how to code for FPGAs, but this is like learning to build a GPU.
I have to say that ray tracing is mind-blowing enough to me, especially when you look at, moving objects and like the camera view moving and it still being able to trace that. But when you start to get into the shadows, I'm super impressed. And then I can't believe that the reflections can be done with these sort of things. It comes up so amazing. And I know it's really not using that much of the old system to do this. I mean, the FPGA's doing the heavy lifting, but there's something about that Instagram filter of SNES graphics that makes you kind of like cock your head and say, this can't possibly be real.
The coolest part of his demo video, I think it's actually in the How I Did It video, he's using the SNES controller to move the camera around, and you see it on the SNES because the SNES is sending the scene description off to this graphics processor, and the graphics processor is just, doing all the processing, leaving it in memory, and the SNES reads it back and displays it on the screen. it's like the SNES is running it, and it is the SNES is running it. It's like he's made the ultimate SNES graphics card. It's just really, it's so rad. I have to admit, I'm a total old school ray tracing nerd. I used to use PovRay back in the day. So if you haven't played around with POV Ray, go check that out. Link in the description. I went back to their website recently and it's still under active development. I last used PovRay in 2001, 2002, almost 20 years ago now, and the project is still going strong. It's a really awesome ray tracing renderer. It's offline, it is not real time, but I downloaded it just to see how fast things would go on a modern computer. I wasn't disappointed, but it's not nearly as fast as Ben's blistering FPGA implementation.
First up on my list of quick hacks this week is we bet you've never seen a pink denture synth. This is a crazy and awesome synthesizer visualizer you might see by Love Holton. It does not actually make the music with the dentures, but you do hear the solenoids that open and close them. What's more kind of eerie is the screams, shrieks, and angelic sounds that come out of the synth are each assigned a different set of choppers in this 5x5 grid based on what pitch you're actually playing. Next up is RC Lawnmower Cuts with Impunity. Daniel from RC Test Flight came up with a diminutive way to automatically mow your lawn. Maybe not so automatically. I think it still needs someone to drive it, but it is the tiniest little X-Acto knife blade lawnmower system that you've ever seen. I think it's doomed to failure from the beginning, but despite that, it ends up doing sort of a job. And finally up, the heavy Raspberry Pi users keep an HDMI to USB capture device around. This is not so much for the exact use that you see here, which is saying for somewhere like $10, $12, something like that, you can get this HDMI input with a USB output that you can use. So you connect an HDMI cable to your Raspberry Pi, and then you connect the USB to your computer, and you don't need a separate screen to see what's going on your Raspberry Pi. I just think it's more interesting because I haven't seen this part before. I've seen the USB-C that goes to an HDMI output. This is like the opposite of that and might be worth having in your own hacking toolkit.
I ordered one the day after I scheduled this article.
It's interesting, right? And the thing is, we saw this 6 months or a year ago on a different project, but we just didn't realize what we had in front of us at the time.
I have exactly this use case. I have my laptop around. I have a million headless Raspberry Pis all around the house. It's so cool to be able to just plug it in, have it show up as a webcam on my laptop, display the screen, and run it remotely. It's actually really clever.
Yes, you should leave this banter in.
I think I will.
All right, that's it for my last quick hack of the year.
All right, it's Christmas quick hacks from me. I've got Christmas presents here for people who are into blinky things, synthesizers, and machine builds. First up, a Remoticon video making glowy origami with Charlene Gonda. This is so great. LED diffusers are awesome because LEDs are just too damn bright and the colors don't mix. Origami is awesome. She's making fantastic origami shapes out of vellum, which give you the volume to get your LED diffusion done right. It looks beautiful. She's got a wall in the back behind her during this whole video that has a matrix of LEDs, all of them diffused by little origami diffusers. It is so cool looking. And if you go to minute 52, you will have a life-changing origami experience where she takes a single sheet of paper, puts a whole bunch of folds in it, and then turns it into a cylinder. And you're like, wow, that's a really cool looking lampshade or something. And then she goes squash and flattens the whole thing into a ring. It is like, what? You just have to go watch it. Minute 52. Trust me on this one. Next up, a synth of your own for not a lot. This is the final build log of Helios 1 by Blog Hoskins. This is the whole deal. It's a really simple synthesizer. It's a bunch of knobs to control the parameters. All of them are connected to potentiometers, which go to the ADC ins on a cheap Uno clone running the Motzi synthesizer library on the inside. It's all digital. It's marvelously simple. You could get this whole thing done for $5 if you have an Uno sitting around and a scrap bin full of potentiometers. Have a look at this one if you've never built a MIDI synthesizer before. And last up, a camera slider with a twist. Jan de Rogi built what I think is the coolest camera slider I've seen in a long time. It's a 3-axis camera slider. It's got 2 tubes along which it runs the long way. Because he has the stepper motor set up kind of like an H-bot, or maybe it's a Core XY, I'm not 100% sure. When they turn together, the little slider moves down the long way on the rods. When they turn against each other, a little pivoting platform on the slider turns, so you can do those nice pan slide tracking shots. But then this one has yet one more axis, and that's the twist. The 2 rails that it's on rotate forward and backwards, so you can do up-down as well as left-right turning as you slide down. It's fantastic, and with 3 degrees of freedom, he has to demo it doing kind of light-duty household robotics chores at the end of the video. That's really fun. He's not really done with it, so he hasn't put the plans out yet, and I could see a whole bunch of different ways you'd want to improve this. Some of which he suggests, like it should take G-code so you can script it with your computer, and maybe you could tweak the sliders here and there. So there's not enough documentation for it yet, but if you know what you're doing with machine builds, you will see this, you will see how to build it yourself better, and you will get on it.
It's time for our Can't Miss Articles of the Week. This is long-form content written by awesome Hackaday writers, and I have picked a magnificent piece by Christina Panos called Tech Hidden in Plain Sight, the Ballpoint Pen. And I gotta say, Elliot, I love this topic. Like, I love this stuff that is such insane engineering that is just nothing to most people. Right? Like, you can get a pack of Bic pens for $6 and you can use all of them or you can lose all of them and you never think about how you got there. But you started off with a patent back in 1888 for something that used a steel ball bearing to apply ink, where we were mostly on the quill or maybe even, using calligraphy pens at that point. It wasn't until about the late 1930s that this nut really got cracked, though, because the ink was a problem, and it was Luxio Biro who came up with an ink formulation that made the ballpoint pen work really well and ended up patenting at that point. Like all good patent stories, though, he was actually beaten to market by Milton Reynolds, who tweaked the design just enough to avoid patent infringement and ended up selling them throughout North America and South America.
From today's perspective, it looks super obvious. And we got even some people in the comments saying, which came first, the roll-on deodorant or the ballpoint pen, right? Because they use exactly the same mechanism. The answer, by the way, is the roll-on deodorant came shortly after the ballpoint pen.
No, really?
This idea was invented, this kind of, you can dispense fluids by putting a blocking ball in the path and then having it slowly roll it out by surface tension, was really a new idea. And the cool thing, I think, is that you mentioned Laszlo Biro was a journalist and had been working with printing ink, and so had been working with these giant printing machines at the time. And they work by putting ink on a sheet of metal, and then you roll it across the newsprint, right? And it sticks to the newsprint. And that's exactly what makes the ink in a ballpoint pen work, is that it's also like a sticky ink. It's not a pigment. It's like a gooey, glommy something ink that then sticks to the paper as you're rolling it along, just like the printer's ink sticks to newsprint. And the ball had been around before that, not very long, but a little bit, and wasn't as successful because you couldn't get slippery water-based inks to stick on the paper. The thing that made it work was getting a sticky ink along with the ball.
But that viscosity problem is also really tough because it's the lubricant for the ball itself.
Can't be too thick.
Right. And then the tolerances are pretty small. Like these are not big points that we're talking on these pens. And so it also can't like dry out to the point where it's going to gum up and prevent that ball from turning. Although anybody that's used a ballpoint pen knows that
It
that
always
happens
does.
all the time.
Yeah.
Except with my favorite of pens. I was so happy to see the first, comment and comment thread on this one talking about the Pilot G2, which is like a gel ink pen, because those are my absolute favorites. I love them. And my wife hates them because they create a very kind of wet and
Yeah, they're
thick
sloppy.
ink. Yeah, and I am left-handed, so you worry about smearing the ink, but I just still love the way that they write.
My experience with them is that they glom up every once in a while, and you write for a long time, and then they build up a blob of surplus ink that then works its way off, and you have to be a little careful about that.
Yeah, but it's like servicing the tip on your soldering iron. You just have to be aware that that's one of the features of the pen. And you can, I put it on a piece of scrap paper and twist the pen so that it rotates around and that gets that glom off of there.
Writing nerds. Christina bags on the fountain pen, which is kind of the predecessor to the ballpoint pen here. And I'm a fountain pen man myself. I've been using them forever. And the fountain pen nerds come out in the comment section here too. So fountain pens represent.
Of course, the gorilla in the room is Bic himself, right? And that's Marcel Bich, who had the BIC as the company, the Bic Cristal in 1950. It was the first disposable pen. And that makes a lot of sense because these were expensive. Like there's a gimbal pen that Christina has an ad for, and she does the inflation adjustment on this, and it's a $180 pen in today's money. And
right.
So can you imagine having this pen that you spent so much money on and then like trying to keep track of that? And then Bic comes along and is like, well, you just use these until they're out and then you don't fill them up again. You just throw them away.
Yeah, thanks for the environment, you jerk. I used a really nice kind of $150 fountain pen for a decade without losing it.
Did you take it out of the house with you?
All the time.
Okay. Well, see, that's impressive. I could see an expensive pen on your desk where you do your writing. But if you're going to take it somewhere and use it in day-to-day life, that's another story.
Kept it in my bag. It traveled with me. It was the pen that I used. And I don't know. I've got a pair of 10-year-old sunglasses, too. I'm that guy who doesn't lose pens or sunglasses. I don't know what my problem is.
You still have it. You still haven't lost it.
I do still have it. It's actually gotten to the point where it's one of these Pilot ones. The opening and closing mechanism is now gummed up enough that it's not really pleasant to use anymore. It leaks ink now. It could probably get cleaned up by someone who knows what they're doing, but I've switched up to a cheap Lamy fountain pen that I picked up in an airport for $15 and has served me for the last 3 years now.
Well, so I heard you use the term last week. A person who repairs watches is an ourist. What is a person who services expensive pens?
A fountain penologist.
A fountain penologist.
That's officially what it is. 100%. I would stake my life on it. No, there must be a word, right?
The world may never know.
The world will never know for the duration of this show. All right, changing gears entirely, let's talk cars. Lewin Day wrote up the World Solar Challenge, which is now 30 years old. This is an engineering competition to see basically how far you can go in a solar car. It's kind of cheating because it takes place in Australia where they have a ton of sunlight. It started off in 1982 as the dream, I guess, of Larry Perkins and his brother Gary, who built a, quote, car. And this thing is basically like a four-wheeled bicycle with a big old solar panel on top called the Quiet Achiever. They managed to drive it 2,518 miles from Perth to Sydney, Australia in 20 days using just solar power, and then founded the World Solar Challenge based on this experience. And for the last 30 years, every 2 years, teams from all over the world, a lot of them academics and, universities, have gotten together to build cars to run this 3,000 kilometer trek across Australia in the middle of the summer. A lot of people in the comments kind of misunderstood this solar challenge. This is a challenge, folks. The idea here is that this is not going to replace your daily driver anytime soon. And the spirit here is kind of how far, how fast can you go with the absolutely limited resources you have, which is, there's no more than 1.4 kilowatts per square meter of surface area anywhere on the earth ever, ever, ever. Like, you've got an absolute hard maximum power intake. And the question is just how much aerodynamics and engine efficiency and solar cells naturally can you pack into this vehicle to get someone across Australia? And the progress that has been made in the last 30 years is absolutely astounding. What was originally a multi-day, I guess the first one was 20 days, but then once it became a competition, there were like 10 days. Nowadays, the times are down to 40-something hours, so just over 3 days to run it. The vehicles are getting so good that in 2013, so 7 years ago, one of the teams was actually penalized for speeding. And so they had to take a 10-minute off their time because they got caught speeding along the way. And in the same year, they introduced the cruiser class. So if you look at these like super aerodynamic vehicles with a solar panel, they're basically flat and the person lies down recumbent and they have skinny little tires and only 3 of them. And it's like a rocket ship going across the Australian desert. They introduced this cruiser class now to be something where the person sits upright, where comfort of the person driving is now a factor in the judging and not just this raw speed. How fast can you get there? And some of these things are starting to look a little bit like cars. And the thing that I thought was even cooler was that this year there's a new class. Well, next year, I guess, because it's 2021, there's a new class being added called the Adventure class. And this is basically just get yourself across the country in whatever kind of vehicle you can cobble together the best you can. And so if you don't fit the rather stringent rules for the challenge class, which is the raw, straight up speed engineering challenge, and if you don't want to carry a couple people in style, or maybe you want to carry more people than just a couple in style and don't fit in the cruiser class, you can put like your solar 4-person bus into the adventure class. No limits on solar panel size. Just get it done.
I do love that inclusion, but the hardcore part of it is that's how you make the discoveries, right? Like putting the engineering happens when you're put under constraints that are not solvable under the current way of doing things. I think this is why I'm so frustrated when we run stories about, some advanced space mission or about like needing space telescopes like Arecibo or whatever, and you see people in the comments are like, well, that's just a waste of money. They should work on this or they should work on that. When you're doing something that hasn't been done before, people get like addicted to trying to solve that problem. And it just pushes the state of the art in so many areas, in like material sciences and manufacturing and quality control. And these things are what trickle down into our everyday lives and give us, ballpoint pens that don't clog. And and I think if you're looking at the state of the art in solar panels like these are using, this is a great like real life conditions test for these brand new things where the people who are working on them aren't otherwise going to be able to put them through their paces as much as this. And so it does take and kind of supercharge the problem solving in a really important area that we're facing right now.
And I think if you look back at the 30-year retrospective here, what you see is that actually the solar side of things hasn't improved all that much, and that what everything else has kind of contributed to this, and things like electric motors are a lot better. The drivers for electric motors are a lot better. We have small, high powerful microcontroller drivers, driving efficient MOSFETs, which are able to drive these brushless DC motors better than they ever were a decade ago. The ability to compute the aerodynamics of these vehicles is better. The battery technology for storing excess energy when you do get it from the sun is so much better now. Even if you throw away the solar part and you just treat the problem as you've got a kilowatt coming in, how do you get across the Australian desert? That then becomes an electric car problem and a maximizing efficiency in electric cars problem. And I think that's part of where you're seeing a lot of the progress coming in here too, is from crossovers with not particularly solar car builds, but just other ultra high efficiency electric car builds. You know, I don't live in a place where there's enough sun. I live in Munich. It's like, it's dark here. Like the sun goes down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon now. And, you know, frankly, we park our car in the garage where there's not much solar energy at all. Like solar isn't an option for us ever, but electric is. It doesn't necessarily make sense from a global energy collection perspective to get the solar energy from on top of your car. You should put the solar panels where the sun is and then transfer the electricity into the car battery, right? Like this is obvious. But if you can make the car more efficient, then you win.
Yeah, and I mean, if you could just pull as much power as you wanted out of your garage wall and put it into your car battery, there'd never be any reason to make your car more efficient.
Right.
But if you scale that up to the number of people who would like to be driving electric vehicles, that power has to come from somewhere. There are huge gains to be made by even very small advancements in efficiency in both charging and storing and converting back into motion. And so things like this are going to make a huge impact. Plus, where do those engineers come from, right? I mean, the people that are working on this are going to be the ones inventing stuff for car companies in the future. That's all the time we have for this episode of the Hackaday podcast, the last one of 2020. As always, we'd love to hear from you. You can leave a comment on the show notes, which you'll find at hackaday.com/podcast. You can email us, editor@hackaday.com. We live and die by the tips that you send us. So if you've done something cool or you see something cool, let us know. tips@hackaday.com. And until next year,
Merry Christmas, keep on hacking, and we'll catch you up in 2021. E-paper photo print. Oh, cripes.
did I screw that up now, Elliot?
Mike, you are kicked off the server.
How dare you? My sensitivities.
Excuse me, champagne burps.
Oh, see, now I screwed it up because I have my thing that I say.
SNES.
SNES.
I'm SNESy.
I'm SNESing out of here.